All right. I don't think anybody else is coming, so we can go ahead and get started. So this week's topic, continuing with the theme of strength and conditioning. Again, to reiterate from last week, this is through the lens of athletic training. So even though it's a strength and conditioning topic, it's not from the lens of a strength and conditioning coach. I have my certified strength and conditioning specialist, but I don't think that qualifies me in terms of speaking with expertise from a strength and conditioning perspective. I still leave that to most of the experts, but I try to take what I learned from the CSCS exam and the coursework and apply it in the athletic training setting. So a lot of valuable resources there. And then just kind of conceptualizing different things like muscle hypertrophy, strength development, all those kinds of things that we put into practice, both from an injury prevention standpoint and also a rehab perspective. So to give an overview, this is kind of how I break down my decision-making tree. So the first thing for me to decide is, and this is not backed by any evidence, this is just me personally, is this it basically falls into one of two macro categories. Is this a rehab strength and conditioning, or is this an injury prevention strength and conditioning? Because they look very different, right? A rehab, we'll get into this in depth a little bit later, but the rehab is primarily going to restore function, and the injury prevention is trying to increase the function. And then it goes down into the micro. So these are the more specifics of the exercise selection. So what's the goal of the exercise? What are we trying to achieve? What is our target? And if we don't have a target in mind, then we're never going to get there. So there's that famous Yogi Berra quote, and it's like, if you don't set a destination, or if you don't have a destination in mind, then you might not get there, or something like that. Pretty comical, but it's very accurate. If you're not aiming for something, then you have no way of measuring whether or not you're on the right direction. So start with the goal in mind, and then go from there in terms of whether the exercise you've chosen is the perfect one to achieve that goal. From there, there's the muscle contribution. So obviously we know that muscles don't work in isolation, and they don't just work by themselves. They have other surrounding muscle groups that are contributing to it, or even in a muscle group itself, it has multiple muscles that are contributing to that contraction. So whether it's, say, the quads, for example, you have the VMO, the VLO, rectus femoris, and vastus medialis. So which of those muscles is going to contribute most to the lift? And for the quads, it's pretty hard to separate them, but there are some researchers who are trying to tease out VMO because it's such an important contributor for like ACL rehab, for example. Then you have the risk versus reward. So if you're going to pick some kind of like a big compound movement, if you're doing like a heavy deadlift, for example, yes, you're going to get a lot stronger. You get a ton of neural adaptation. You're going to put a ton of stress on the body. But is that worth them coming in the next day and they're so sore that they can't walk or they can't run? So now they're missing out on the training side of things. And for the most part, that answer is going to be no, because it's not worth them missing practice, because that's where they're really going to make the biggest difference in terms of their excellence in sport. It's going to be in practice. So if they're not doing the more technical development side of things because you wrecked them in the gym, yeah, that's probably a poor decision. Not always. I mean, there are times where, especially in the off season, where you want to push somebody a little bit heavier. And so if they have a history of a hamstring injury, for example, maybe the off season is the right time to push them a little bit harder. And then if they have so much soreness that next day, or their joints are so wrecked from it, their hip and their low back hurt, now they can just lay in bed and take that day off to rest and recover. So risk versus reward is an important consideration, especially in season when they have other things that are important. And then you have the individual variations, like the tempo or the joint angle, all the different specifics that you can play around with to try to make the exercise just a little bit more precise for what it is that you're trying to achieve. Any questions about that so far before we dive into depth? Cool. So breaking down this concept of the macro a little bit further, these pictures kind of demonstrate, at least in my mind, a progression for a hamstring exercise. So in a rehab setting, maybe you're doing something really basic like a hamstring set, and you're just doing that really light contraction of an isometric. And so then after you can get there, then you're progressing, and you're trying to go along the continuum of the regressions and progressions. So start them wherever you can start. That's typically my mantra, is if they can't do a hamstring set, then they're probably going to do treatment only. So then there's no point in even trying to do a slide out or a stiff leg deadlift if they can't even do a hamstring set. Like, they can't produce that much force. They're just going to aggravate that injury. So take them back as far as you need to, but no further. Don't take them all the way back to a hamstring set if they can do like a glute bridge or a slide out. And again, with the goal for rehab is restoring function. So if you're trying to get them back to the point where they can do a stiff leg deadlift, then you're trying to use these progressions to kind of gradate that approach. You're trying to really smooth it out, and so you don't get this giant jump from a hamstring set to a stiff leg deadlift. It's really trying to make that as smooth of a transition as possible. So again, don't regress them further than they need to, but then also don't progress them past the point of where they're going to be functional. They're going to get a benefit from that exercise. Pretty simple concept, but the application takes a little bit of time in terms of considering which exercises are truly more stressful for various muscle parts. And we'll get into the details of those in the next page with the micro. But again, just keep this in mind as you're going through the rest of these slides. Is this a rehab or is this an injury prevention? Is this a regression or a progression? Are we trying to restore function, or are we trying to increase their capacity to prevent future injury? So there's a ton of different details that you can consider with the micro. And I think this is where ATs a lot of times get lost in the woods, and they focus so much on like one of these that they forget about all the other benefits. And the paper that I attached for this week was really good at breaking down all of the different considerations. So things from range of motion, strength, power, endurance, all of those different things. All the way down to the point of like a pain profile. What's their response after you apply this exercise? What are the different contraction types, and how do those contribute to the adaptations that we're trying to get? So trying to kind of pick out, like, I would suggest probably picking out like one big goal, like where we're trying to work on strength, for example. Okay, if we're trying to work on strength, how do we know we're on the right path? The easiest way to know is if you feel the muscle working during the exercise, and if you feel soreness after the exercise is over. So if you feel that muscle's like working and then you feel soreness, that's probably a good sign that you're using the right muscle. If you, for example, are trying to increase quad strength and you put them under a bar and you're saying, let's do a barbell back squat. If they do it and the whole time they're just saying, no, I just feel my hips are working, my glutes are really engaged, and I just feel like my glutes are fatiguing or my calves are fatiguing, that's probably not working the quads as much as you might think it is. Even though the exercise is designed to work the quads, their individual anatomy might prevent it, or their movement pattern might prevent the activation of the quads to a sufficient amount. And so then the next day they wake up and it's like, yeah, man, my back hurts and like my hips hurt, but I don't feel anything in my quads. My quads are fine. You probably need to modify for that individual. So if strength is the goal, you should probably feel that muscle group working. One way that you can measure that is through the muscle contribution. You see the EMG measurement. So you can do it. The paper talks about a couple different ways that you can measure muscle contribution, and one of them is through a max voluntary isometric contraction. That's pretty common terminology, but it's typically through either surface EMG or the like the needle EMG. And I don't know the exact terminology for that, but if you're measuring electrical conduction and muscle recruitment, then the other way is the fMRI. So you're seeing the fluid response to the muscle contraction. So there's a couple different ways you can measure, like if you're in a lab setting and you're trying to truly see if the muscles are working. But then the other thing to consider is, okay, well, if that muscle's not working, what are the synergists that are probably taking over? So maybe it's a compensation, maybe they're leaning to one side or the other, or maybe in a squat they're using their glutes instead of their quads because you're just trying to stand up as opposed to extend the knees. So there's some different cues that you can play around with there in terms of getting more of a mind muscle connection, but the important thing there is, again, feeling the muscle working that you're trying to work. And there, it could be a load issue as well. Like maybe you just put on too much weight and now they're not focused on their technique or their contraction. They're just focused entirely on trying to drive that weight up, which has its pros and its cons. But for exercise selection, you probably want to pick the exercise that gets them a good contraction so that you know that you're going to produce that strength response that you're trying to get. Like I said, you can dive into any one of these topics with a 30-minute conversation, but for the most part, just being aware that all of these are different kind of micro decisions that you can make to fine tune which exercise you're choosing. Any question about any of these details? Anybody want to break down anything a little bit further?
I just want to reiterate something that you had mentioned that I thought was great, and that was getting information from your athlete or from your patient. Like you had mentioned, if you want to strengthen your quads on the squat, you want to ask the athlete, okay, where are you feeling it? And this is something that I've been trying to incorporate in physical therapy too, especially with someone who is not an athlete, because a lot of people don't know what they're supposed to be feeling during an exercise. And one thing that I learned that was really helpful was trying to leave it as open-ended as possible. For example, if we're doing a squat and we want to strengthen their quads, I probably won't say, "Do you feel it in your quads?" I like to leave it as open-ended as possible. I'll be like, "So where do you feel it?" And that way, I'm not biasing them to say anything. But I think that's a great point that you made, because I think a lot of times we can get stuck in like looking at their movement pattern and making sure everything looks good, but oftentimes our patients or our athletes can give us such valuable information.
Yeah, I think there can be value. You talked about like the open-ended question, which I like, because they have to come up with their own answer instead of following your lead. But I think there's also times where it can be appropriate to lead somebody, and maybe you're trying to get them to buy into the program, and maybe you're saying, that looks like you're contracting your quads. Did you feel that? Or maybe you're saying, that looked like a really strong contraction in your quads, like especially for an ACL. You need that encouragement to kind of guide the rehab, and sometimes they can get discouraged if they're not feeling it the way that they should be. And so you can kind of cue them to be in I guess, a better mood or a better state of mind in that rehab session. So there's pros and cons to each of those, but you just kind of have to use your clinical judgment as to which is best for that situation. The other thing that came to mind when you were talking about that, and making sure that somebody's feeling it, if you give them all the cues in the world and they're still not feeling that contraction, there's some good research in the bodybuilding community with trying to trigger hypertrophy and activation in the muscle. And a simple way that you can get them to feel it a bit more is if you just touch the body part that you're trying to contract. So for example, if I want to get the deltoids to contract, all I do is I just poke it or tap it, and they're going to feel, and they get that feedback. Oh, okay, that's the part that's supposed to be working. And then they can kind of create that mind muscle connection a little bit better. They get that sensation plus then the contraction. And so that kind of cues a little bit more muscle recruitment. So another good technique that you can use if they're not getting the contraction that they're looking to feel or that you're hoping that they produce. All right. So for the literature review, there is a huge body of literature in terms of both the professional, like research grade quality, and also just the I guess like bodybuilding or strength community. And so there's a lot of good resources out there. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for like clinical quality, then you're probably going to look for these second two links, the EMG activation, and it provides a list of exercises for the adductor, the hamstring. There's a million of these. All you have to do is just use a Google search or a Google Scholar search, and you can find a bunch of different studies in terms of which exercises activate the muscle group, that whatever the target muscle group is, most effectively. And so I've seen them for the quads, I've seen them for the calves, I've seen them for the deltoids, I've seen them for pretty much everything. So if that's something you're interested in, just search that, and then you can find the muscle group. For soccer athletes and for a lot of different sports, adductors and hamstrings are going to be problematic for a wide variety. So that goes for football, basketball, baseball. Pretty much every sport's going to have adductors and hamstrings. So that's why I felt it was best to include those two. The NSCA Basics of Strength and Conditioning is also another great scientific peer-reviewed publication. And I included that one last week as well, but I think it's still important here. There's a page specifically that discusses exercise selection, but there's a ton of good information there in terms of dosage and exercise selection, timing, like building a periodized plan for the athletes, all of that kind of stuff. It's like a 100-page document with citations and resources. So it's a really big document, but it's really good quality. So if you're interested in the strength and conditioning side of things, definitely check that out. It's free as well. For video references or resources, the Jeff Nippard fundamentals playlist is again another great resource. He's got, I think, 7 episodes now where he breaks down the different kind of topics that you can play around with in terms of sets and reps or number of sets per week and exercise selection and all of that kind of stuff. So really good quality, but again, less of that scientific. He's actually a bit more scientific than like your typical like bro science, but he's not peer reviewed, obviously. So the 2 episodes that I found the most relevant for this week's topic of exercise selection were 1 and 4. 1 was I think it was like a 7-minute video, and then 4, I believe, was only like 2 or 3 minutes. So short watches, but definitely good value there in terms of kind of seeing how he thinks about selecting exercises, whether that's from a health and injury prevention perspective or that's from a muscle recruitment and hypertrophy perspective. The other one that I thought was really good was the Juggernaut training systems. They gave basically 3 reasons to either choose or not choose an exercise. And this is like a 1:30, 2-minute long video. Like it's really short. So I suggest everybody go watch it. But he just gives 3 really quick kind of thought processes for deciding upon an exercise. One of them was health, one of them was like pain profile, and one of them was performance, I believe. But his explanation was really concise, but really good quality. Take a quick pause. Anybody have questions? Anybody want to discuss anything? You keep going. Cool. So the paper, I apologize, the paper's not as beautiful. It doesn't have a cool logo at the top like the last few weeks have been. The only full text PDF that I could find was a link with this. I think it was a university publication, and so it didn't have the same aesthetics as the other peer-reviewed journals and stuff like that. So the general background or the overview of the paper, it was an evidence-based approach for selecting exercises that prevent hamstring injury. And so they went through a million different variables and kind of teased out which were the most important and which exercises adhere to the most important. Yeah, I saw there was a PDF one as well, but when I clicked on it, I think you had to be a member for it. Or maybe you had to have a subscription. It could be free, I'm not sure. But the yeah, so the overview of the paper, the gist of it is they were trying to find the exercises that matched with the most important variables that prevented the most hamstring injuries. And so some of the things that they were kind of considering, going back to the macro, it was definitely an injury prevention study. And so this was focused on increasing capacity, trying to progress exercises to make them difficult, but then also trying to create those adaptations. Some of the adaptations that they were focused on were strength, fascicle length, especially for the biceps femoris long head, the synergists that are involved. So it was in the hamstring group. So their primary focus was just within the hamstring group itself, such as the biceps femoris short head, the semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. So I was a bit surprised they didn't talk as much about the contributions in synergists from like the glutes for hip extension or the calf, specifically the gastroc for the knee flexion exercises. But nonetheless, they did talk about the different recruitment and specifically with the EMG and the fMRI for the different muscles in the hamstring group. And then the last thing that they really harped on was the contraction type and the importance of the eccentric contraction for the hamstrings in comparison to the concentric contraction. So the especially when you're trying to promote strength and then fascicle length, the eccentric seems to do a lot better job of those things than the concentric portion. That doesn't mean that there's no place for the concentric. Maybe early stage in the rehab where your force production is a lot lower, your concentric might be where you start somebody if they can't tolerate heavy isometric or an eccentric exercise. So again, you just have to kind of use your clinical judgment and think about the contraction type and say, is this appropriate for our goals of restoring function? Or is this maybe better suited exercise if we're trying to push somebody's capacity along, get them more fit so that they aren't having as many injuries? So to break down the macro a little bit more and kind of how they went about the injury prevention, the exercises that they found to be the most stimulative for strength development, and so they were measuring particularly with force development. So if you had somebody on a Nord board, for example, the Vald device, a couple different studies they listed saw that like anything less than 279, for example, was an increased risk factor. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was definitely an increased risk factor. And then the other study that they listed was less than 337 newtons, which is not a ton of force. I mean, like a fairly athletic person can produce that amount of hamstring force. But then the probably the biggest takeaway that I had from these citations were just a 10 Newton increase, which is hardly anything. I mean, that's not even 10%. 3% increase in force production was a 9% decrease in hamstring injuries. So it doesn't take a lot of strength and conditioning work in order to prevent some of these injuries. You get somebody to do some basic hamstring exercises, regardless of what your exercise selection is, and they're probably going to have a decreased risk. So they talked a lot about the hamstring conditioning, I believe was the word that they use, or knee flexion conditioning. And so regardless of which exercise you're choosing, if you're getting them stronger, which as long as you're, again, feeling tension in the muscle, if you're feeling the muscle working and you're feeling some soreness after, like the day after or later that day, you're probably getting the muscle stronger. And it doesn't take much in order to reduce the risk of injury. So the next thing they talked about with the risk factors was the asymmetries, and the two numbers that they listed were 15% asymmetry was a 2.4 times risk for hamstring injury, and then a 20% or greater was a 3.4 times risk for hamstring injury. So kind of depending on where you sit on like the conservative versus aggressive approach, you might want to do either in a rehab, maybe you're measuring the asymmetry and you want that asymmetry to be down below 15%, so then that injury risk goes down. Or maybe you're saying from an injury prevention perspective, okay, this guy came in with a baseline of 20%. He's at a 3.4x risk for hamstring injury. Maybe we need to really focus on his hamstring asymmetry through his injury prevention programming. For the two most commonly referred or cited exercises for the injury prevention group was the Nordic exercise, the Nordic hamstring curl, and this is not new. Like, people have been bragging up this exercise for quite a long time. And the eccentric portion of the flywheel exercise. So the flywheel design is a little bit different than any other exercise in that it's produced by a cable and a wheel that's spinning. So it's pulling them down into the eccentric, and then they have to produce force to keep the wheel spinning. And then the momentum is what's creating the resistance, as opposed to a free weight or a cable where you're just moving free weights through a different like leverage system. So the flywheel is a little bit different compared to the other exercises, but the eccentric portion in it seems to really contribute to the injury prevention perspective. So it's something to consider. There would be, if you're trying to prevent injury, maybe those are the two exercises you want to kind of focus on for a strength perspective. If you're trying to promote some of those other variables, if you care more about muscle recruitment and EMG activation, it might depend. Maybe there's some variation or nuance there. If you're trying to focus on the angle of torque, the peak torque production, maybe you're focusing again on a different exercise. Maybe it changes slightly, but for strength purposes, eccentric overload on the flywheel and Nordic hamstring curl, the eccentric portion, seemed to do a good job. For the micro, so these are the things that the paper focused primarily on, was the strength, the biceps femoris fascicle length, and then the synergist. So the kind of comparison, or what they teased out, were the pairing of the semimembranosus and the biceps femoris long head, but then also the pairing of the semitendinosus and the biceps femoris short head. So those two muscles can seem to have different pairings in terms of the exercise selection. So particularly, they were discussing with the hip extension exercises versus knee flexion exercises. The hip extension seems to get the semimembranosus and the biceps femoris long head, whereas the knee flexion group seems to get a little bit more of the semitendinosus and the biceps femoris short head. So again, important considerations depending on what your goal is. If you have an injury, a muscle strain in the biceps femoris long head, maybe you want to focus on more of those hip dominant exercises where you're doing something like a stiff leg deadlift, or maybe when you're doing a semitendinosus rehab, maybe you're wanting to focus more on the knee flexion exercises like a Nordic or a prone hamstring curl. So it's not a perfect system, and there's some room for debate there. There's even amongst strength and conditioning professionals or performance coaches, there's definitely a debate in terms of what's best. But again, all we're trying to do as athletic training or medical professionals is decide what's the best way to target this muscle in a rehab context and in an injury prevention context. So with that in mind, you can kind of lean one way or the other in terms of which knee or hip dominant strategy you're focusing on. And then lastly was the contraction type. And again, we touched on it a little bit, but the eccentric portion seems to really provide a lot of bang for your buck in terms of the injury prevention. So it's a lot better, especially for the fascicle length, because it produces an increased length. And the stat that I wrote down was the eccentric actions especially for like the Nordic, it increased the fascicle length by I think 20%, and the concentric decreased the length in I think about 8%, if I remember correctly. So again, depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to promote length as an injury prevention mechanism, then you probably want to focus on some kind of an eccentric action, whether that's an eccentric prone hamstring curl or a Nordic exercise. But if you're trying to produce, I guess, athleticism, surely there's some concentric action there. Like in running, you're producing constant concentric action. So you need both, but for an injury prevention effort, you probably want to focus a bit more on the eccentric actions. Any questions, any discussion there?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
What's up?
So from my understanding, quite a few hamstring injuries occurred during the late swing phase of sprinting, which is my understanding why eccentric hamstring strengthening might be more beneficial. But do you know of any other reason why it seems to be that the data is saying that eccentric strengthening has better preventative benefits than concentric?
The one that comes to mind like immediately is the fascicle length. So if you think about like in that late swing phase, what position are they in? They're in a hip flexion, so the hamstring's getting lengthened by that, and then they're also into that knee extension position. And so they're also getting lengthened. That hamstring's at max length with that rapid eccentric force. So as their hamstring's going through that rapid eccentric, it's also getting stretched to its extreme. So the fascicle length is a protective factor, or at least seems to be via the research, a mediator of hamstring injury by producing a little bit more fascicle length. Then it's not stretched to the extreme quite as much. It gives you a little bit more slack to play with in that rapid eccentric. And so that's what the paper was talking about, especially in the biceps femoris long head, which is really common with those sprint type exercise or sprint type strains. So when you're targeting that muscle group, you're probably going to do some combination of a eccentric flywheel, and you're focusing on really lengthening that muscle out, or a Nordic hamstring curl, where you're going down into that lower angle. As you get there, you're getting that stretching portion in that eccentric action. or you're going to do a stiff legged deadlift, something with a really heavy weight, and you're really focusing on keeping those legs pretty well locked out, not completely locked in straight position, but keeping them pretty straight to then put maximum tension on the hamstrings. You're really getting a big stretch there. So the fascicle length is a big one. I'm sure I could take a stab at a couple other reasons, but in terms of what's actually backed by the evidence, I know fascicle length is a big one that's pointed out within this paper. This research group is actually pretty big into hamstring injury prevention or hamstring kind of injury statistics. And so if you're curious about like hamstring injuries and want to know more about them, I would search for the Matthew Bourne guy. He's the primary author on this paper. And then also David Opar, it has a ton of publications on the matter. I'm sure the other people do as well, but those are the ones that I've seen the most. Any other questions? Izzy, you got anything?
No, but I mean, I liked this paper just because track season has started, so I know I'm going to see a lot of hamstring stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, the track season, I have a love-hate relationship with track. I love it because it's so simple. Like there's not a ball that you have to track around. There's no variation. Like it's literally just linear running over and over and over again. And so it becomes a game of like how well can you nail the basics, because there's not a lot of variation like you get in team sports. It's just you and yourself in that lane. And it really comes down to your technique, your physical preparedness, and then from a rehab perspective, again, there's not a ton of variability. Like you're not going to take somebody out and work on their shooting, for example, in a track rehab. It's a lot more important to nail the basics in terms of these kind of muscle rehab strategies. So the implications they gave, the question that they kind of posed in the discussion portion of their kind of summary was the point that a lot of coaches will make, and a lot of, in relative to your point, Izzy, the track and field community says that the rehab needs to mimic the load, the range of motion, and the velocities of their sport. So if you're taking somebody through a hamstring rehab in basketball, for example, it should look a lot different than track and field because there's higher velocities in track. The range of motion is going to be greater, and the loads are going to be a lot higher because it's such a high, fast speed that they're operating at. The authors pitch that as a question to then follow up and say, well, that makes sense in theory. Like, yes, it just at like first glance, it seems to make sense that you would want to do that. But if all you're trying to do is mimic the loads, the range of motion, and the velocities in your rehab, are you truly addressing the risk factors that were identified as risks for hamstring injury or re-injury within this paper? And they argue that it's not sufficient because you're not addressing things like fascicle length. If all you're trying to do is get somebody to move through faster and faster speeds of hip angular velocity, for example. So if you're looking at the thighs angular velocity and you're saying, well, this person's moving as fast as they are going to in a sprint, they shouldn't get injured if they go sprint. Well, that's maybe part of the rehab, but you're probably also missing the fascicle length. You're missing the strength, the force production. Maybe you're missing some of the eccentric action because you're focused on the concentric angular velocity. So there's a lot of different variables, again, that you can consider. And I don't think you need to really nail all of them for it to be a good rehab. But if you can pick out maybe the 2 or 3 most important and nail those in the rehab, then yeah, you're probably going to be pretty sound. So then again, they said train for biceps femoris long head fascicle length. That was a huge risk factor, and they suggest doing that pretty much for any athlete group, any injury. And that goes for both the injury prevention group and the rehab group. So train for that biceps femoris long head fascicle length, and they gave several ways to accommodate that. Nordics are great because they do a lot of different things at once. So they're going to give you your strength exercise. They're going to give you that fascicle length. They're going to give you the EMG activation. They're going to give you muscle hypertrophy. They're going to give you hypertrophy of the musculotendinous junction. They give you so many benefits and not a lot of downside. From a performance perspective, they talked about the Nordics versus the flywheel in terms of increasing sprint speed, and the other one they compared it to was vertical jump, max vertical jump. And so the Nordics, again, being that it's a bit more of a knee dominant strategy, maybe you train that muscle group a little bit differently. Maybe you get some of that semitendinosis and biceps femoris short head, and then it translates to more of a jump strategy than a sprint strategy where you get a lot more hip involvement. So they talked about, from a performance perspective, the flywheel eccentrics improve the sprint speed, but the Nordics increased the vertical jump. So maybe there's some different translations, again, depending on what sport you're working with. Maybe for a basketball athlete with a hamstring injury, maybe you want to focus more on that Nordic, versus maybe with a track and field athlete, maybe you're focusing more on that flywheel eccentric. Or maybe with something like I'm trying to think of a good example for a stiff-legged deadlift. I don't know. Arguments could be made for pretty much any of those things, but as long as your rationale fits your goals, then you should be fine. Again, they talked about the hip extension strategies versus the knee flexion strategies and those dominant movements. And they talked about the correlation of the biceps femoris long head and the semimembranosus during that stiff-legged deadlift, primarily for the hip extension movement pattern. And then for the knee flexion, it's primarily going to be, and again, you're going to get contribution from all of these muscles during all of these exercises. You're just talking about prioritizing and trying to get a little bit more precise in your exercise selection. So for your biceps femoris short head and semitendinosis, you're going to try to prioritize the Nordic or the leg curl a little bit more. Any questions about that stuff? Cool. They gave a lot of statistics. This was a really dense paper in terms of citations. It felt like one giant 30-page literature review. Like there wasn't a lot of contextual information until the last page and a half. And a lot of it is kind of dry statistics and says this author found this and this author found this. So it's a bit dry, but I think there are some interesting implications there in terms of the return to play context, the strength context, the injury prevention context, the fascicle length, the angular range of motion, the angular velocity, the hypertrophy, all of those different things that are important. And they really provide a statistical evidence or an evidence-based approach for all of these different exercises. So good for them to go that in depth, but also kind of a boring read. So in summary, the way that I conceptualize categories for exercise selection is, in the macro, is this a rehab or is this an injury prevention approach? And if it's either of those, what's the exercise goal in mind? What's the muscle contribution of the various exercises? What's the risk versus reward? And what are some variations we can do to tweak it to get it to align better with the exercise goal at hand? So that is all I've got for you. Any last minute questions? Anything anybody wants to discuss? Any cases or difficulties?
Yeah, I'll mention. I think, and you kind of alluded to this too, that there's so many different variables, and when you're trying to prescribe an exercise, that definitely for me, it can kind of get overwhelming sometimes, because you want to dial in and you want to pick what's going to be, you want to get the most bang for your buck in everything that you do. So yeah, it can be overwhelming at times, but I think just picking 2 or 3 variables and making sure that's as dialed in as it could possibly be is a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a million exercises for each muscle group, and whether you're in the gym space and you're trying to promote performance or hypertrophy, or if you're in the rehab space and you're trying to return somebody to their sport, either way, there's a million exercises you can choose from. Again, I think that it really boils down to how precise you're getting. But as long as you're doing the bulk, pick an exercise that you feel the muscle working and you feel sore the next day, and you've probably got it pretty good. That should give you 70% of the benefit right there. Then from there, you can get a little bit more nuance and say, okay, well, is this a compound movement? Is this something that's going to cause a lot of joint stiffness and joint soreness? or inflammation in the joints, or is this just a muscle isolation and they're just going to get muscle hypertrophy and fatigue? There's benefits to each, but then you have to kind of time it. And so that probably takes you another maybe 15-20% of the way there. Then the last 10% of it, you're splitting hairs, but if you can split the hairs accurately, then you're getting just that little bit more fine-tuned in your exercise selection. Cool. So that wraps up this week. Thank you both for being here. And next week, we'll continue with the compensatory movements. So talking about those a little bit more detail in terms of the compensation strategies for various injuries and how they might be shifting off to one side or the other. Maybe they're using one body part or the other, and talk a little bit more about the biomechanics of the compensations that happen in a rehab context. All right. We'll see you both next week, hopefully.